Hello everybody and welcome back to Law and Court Cases, and in today's video we're going to be going over a child abduction case. What led from one girl's harrowing experience of being held by her captives to being saved and now being a successful reporter, mother and wife. Today we are covering the story of Elizabeth Smart, so without further ado let's get into the video. Elizabeth Ann Smart was born on November 3rd of 1987 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Her parents were Edward and Lois Smart. Her family were a part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the LDS Church. She is the second oldest child in her family. She has 4 brothers and 1 sister. She was a dedicated student, and later in her life, when she returned to study, she earned her Bachelor's of Music in Harp Performance. Now moving on to Smart's abductors. Brian David Mitchell was born on October 18th of 1953 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He is the third of 6 children and came from a Mormon family. His mother was a teacher and his father was a social worker. It's reported that Mitchell's father showed his adolescent son explicit photos from a medical journal in order to teach Mitchell about sex. And in order to teach him about independence, he would drive Mitchell to unfamiliar parts of Salt Lake City and drop him off, leaving him to find his own way home. At the age of 16, Mitchell exposed himself to a child and was sent to a juvenile hall. At 19, he married 16-year-old Karen Miner, with whom he had 2 children. After their divorce, Miner was awarded custody of both children, after which Mitchell temporarily fled with the children to New Hampshire. He resided in New Hampshire for 2 years, where he joined a Hare Krishna commune. Mitchell had a history of drug and alcohol abuse in his adult life, and upon returning to Salt Lake City, he was inspired to seek sobriety by his brother, who had recently returned from a mission. Upon returning to Salt Lake City, Mitchell had 2 additional children with his second wife, Debbie, whom herself had 3 children from a previous marriage. Debbie alleged that Mitchell was abusive during their marriage, and they divorced in 1984. After their separation, Debbie alleged that Mitchell was sexually abusive to their 3-year-old son. However, the claim could not be medically confirmed. Despite it not being confirmed, Mitchell's future visitations with his children was ordered to be supervised by the Division of Child and Family Services. One of Debbie's daughters from her previous marriage would later claim in her life that Mitchell was sexually abusive to her and did so for 4 years. On the day that Mitchell and Debbie's divorce was finalised, he married Wanda Elaine Barzy, born on November 6th of 1945, also in Salt Lake City, Utah. At the time of their marriage, she was 40 years old, a divorcee, and had 6 children. Barzy had a troubled relationship with her children. One of her daughters would later refer to her as a monster. She also claimed that Wanda fed pet rabbits to her for dinner. Together, Mitchell and Barzy were actively involved in the LDS Church. However, this is when Mitchell's delusions began. He eventually began going by the name Emmanuel, claiming to be a prophet of God who experienced visions. Understandably, for this, he was excommunicated from the church. Barzy began going by the name Hepzibah, and the two would begin begging and preaching in downtown Salt Lake City. Mitchell presented himself as the epitome of the image of Jesus. He would dress in white robes and a tunic, and even grew a long beard. Now moving on to the abduction. In the early hours of June 5th of 2002, Mitchell broke into the home of Ed and Lois Smart in the Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City. It was here that he entered the room of Elizabeth and her sister Mary Catherine, who was just 9 years old at the time. Mary Catherine was awakened during this time, but she pretended to be asleep. She would later go on to make reports of what she saw or what she believed she saw. The man was white and about the height of her brother Charles, who was 5'8" or 172 centimeters. She claimed he looked to be about 30 to 40 years of age and wore light-coloured clothes and a golf hat, when in fact he was actually wearing black clothes, did not have a golf hat, and was 48 years of age. The man had dark hair and also dark hair on his arms and on the back of his hands. During the abduction, Elizabeth was threatened at knife point, but Mary Catherine initially thought that this was a gun at the time. She said she never got a good look at the man's face, but she did recognise his voice, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Upon leading Elizabeth out of the room, she stubbed her toe, saying "ouch," to which the man replied, "You better be quiet and I won't hurt you." When her sister Elizabeth asked, "Why are you doing this?" the man's reply was not too clear to Mary Catherine, though she thought he may have said for ransom. When she thought Elizabeth and her abductor were gone, Mary Catherine attempted to go to her parents' bedroom, but only narrowly avoided being seen by Mitchell and Elizabeth, who were outside the bedroom of one of the family's boys. She crept back into her bed and she hid there for an undetermined amount of time, but she believed it was possibly over 2 hours. Just before 4 a.m, Mary Catherine woke her parents and told them what had happened. Initially, they shook her off, thinking she had been dreaming, but her parents quickly realised this was the truth when they found a window screen that had been cut open with a knife. Of course, they then went to the police, and on June 6th of 2002, Ed and Lois went on television and pleaded for the kidnapper to return their daughter. Hearing about this child abduction, the community sprung into action, trying to do everything they could to find the missing girl. A massive regional search was organised by the Laura Recovery Centre. It involved up to 2,000 volunteers each day, as well as dogs and planes. Various websites carrying flyers that could be printed and also were circulated via the internet were also used. After many days of intensive searching, the community-led search was ended and efforts were directed to other means of finding little Elizabeth. Despite trying, Mary Catherine's observations were of little use to the police, and they were unable to find any evidence such as fingerprints or DNA that was usable. A search was performed using bloodhounds, which proved to be unsuccessful, at which point the police questioned and interviewed hundreds of potential suspects, including a 26-year-old who had been cleared after being located in a West Virginia hospital. The investigation had its side effect of returning several at-large criminals to prison, but despite this, Elizabeth was still not found. To keep Elizabeth's name in the press, her family used a variety of strategies, including making a website about her abduction and provided home videos, so if anyone was to see Elizabeth out in public, they had something to compare it to. After her kidnapping, Smart was taken into the woods to an encampment outside of Salt Lake City, where she was met by Wanda Barzee. According to Smart's testimony, Barzee just proceeded to eventually wash her feet and told her to change out of her pyjamas and into a robe-type garment. Smart initially refused, but Barzee said if she didn't, she would have Brian Mitchell come rip her pyjamas off of her. Understandably terrified, Elizabeth put the robe on, and at this point Mitchell decided he would perform a ceremony. It was at this point that the horrible abuse that Elizabeth would suffer began. Mitchell would go on to sexually assault Smart multiple times, and Mitchell claimed to be an angel as he told Smart that he was a Davidic king who would emerge in 7 years, be stoned by a mob, lie down in the street for 3 days, and then rise up to kill the Antichrist. He told Smart that she would be one of many virgin brides that he planned to kidnap, each of whom would accompany him as he battled the Antichrist. It's clear from this that Mitchell was definitely delusional, but it's unclear if he genuinely believed this or was this manic delusion that he was experiencing. In order to keep Smart contained and to prevent her from escaping, she was shackled to a tree by a metal cable. This allowed her limited mobility outside of the tent that she occupied. It was later revealed during court testimony that Mitchell repeatedly sexually assaulted Smart, sometimes multiple times a day, and forced her to look at pornographic magazines and regularly threatened to kill her. He often forced her to drink alcohol and to take drugs to lower her resistance to him. And both parties starved her, and when they did feed her, they fed her garbage. Smart's abuse was facilitated with the assistance of Barzee, whom Smart would later refer to as the most evil woman she had ever met. Despite being held hostage by them, Smart did accompany Mitchell and Barzee in public on numerous occasions, but her presence was always concealed, either obscuring her with concealments such as headscarves and a face veil. Around 2 months after her abduction, Mitchell and Barzee decided they were going to leave Salt Lake City and move to either Boston or New York City. To research potential places to relocate, they visited the Salt Lake City Public Library and took Smart with them, making her wear the veil and headscarf to conceal her identity. Despite this, they were noticed by a library patron due to their unusual style of dress, each wearing a full-length robe as well as their veils and headscarves, but the patron was convinced to call the police upon looking closely at Smart's eyes. A police detective arrived at the library and confronted Mitchell, Barzy and Smart. However, he was deterred by Mitchell, who claimed that Smart was his daughter, calling her Augustine Marshall. He also claimed they were unable to remove their veils and garb on religious grounds. When attempting to question the women, the detective got no responses from either Barzy or Smart. Mitchell replied to this by saying their religion prohibited women from speaking in public. Smart would later go on to say that Barzy signalled for her not to move, and she gripped her leg under the table. Smart would later go on to recall the incident. She said, "I felt like Hope was walking out the door. I was mad at myself that I didn't say anything. Mad at myself for not taking the chance. So close. I feel terrible that the detective hadn't pushed harder. He just walked away." End quote. Despite this close call, Smart would still go on to visit grocery stores and restaurants with the couple. However, at these locations, she went unnoticed. In September of 2002, Mitchell and Barzy left Salt Lake City with Smart, relocating to San Diego County in California. It was here that they held Smart in an encampment in a dry creek bed in Lakeside. During her time in captivity, Mitchell and Barzy relocated with Smart several times to different encampments in the San Diego County, often moving in the middle of the night. On February 12th of 2003, Mitchell was arrested in El Canyon for breaking into a church and spending several days in jail over the incident. As I mentioned before, Elizabeth's younger sister, Mary Catherine, thought she recognised her sister's abductor's voice. It wasn't until October of 2002 that Mary suddenly realised why she recognised that voice. Because he was the unemployed man that the family knew as Emmanuel. The family had hired him for a day of work on the roof and to rake leaves. Despite having this information, the police were sceptical about the short time Emmanuel had worked for the family. They said a long time had elapsed, and the short time that Mary Catherine had heard the abductor's voice, they couldn't be 100% sure. However, the family was still sent a sketch artist. They drew Emmanuel's face from their descriptions, and in February, this drawing was released to the media. This sketch was shown on the Larry King Live and in America's Most Wanted. The drawing was recognised by relatives of Mitchell, who gave police contemporary photographs of him, and this was the information that the public needed to bring Elizabeth home to her family. On March 12th of 2003, Mitchell was spotted with a woman and a girl in Sandy, Utah, by two separate couples who had seen photos of Mitchell on the news. The woman was Wanda Barzy, and the girl, of course, was Elizabeth Smart. Both couples reported their recognition of Mitchell to the Sandy Police Department, which immediately dispatched police officers to the location. It was during this time that Mitchell and Barzy were arrested, because Smart was finally recognised. Finally, Elizabeth was safe, and returned to her family after being gone for 9 months. The scary thing about where she was found is that she was approximately only 18 miles away from where she was kidnapped in the first place. 1 month after the recovery of Elizabeth Smart, the state of Utah superseded the then existing Rachel Alert with the nationwide AMBER Alert Child Abduction Alert System, in part to conform with recently impending nationwide procedures. Although the Rachel Alert was superseded, the system had been a success in the 2 years of its existence. When it came time to look at prosecution for Mitchell, the court required Mitchell to undergo a contemporary evaluation. I think at this point the wheels in Mitchell's head began to turn on how he could turn this story in his favour. Based on his claims of being a religious prophet, the court decided that he needed to be evaluated. While awaiting the evaluation, Mitchell was incarcerated at the Utah State Hospital. Stephen Golding, a psychiatrist hired by the defense, distinguished between zealous belief and delusion, and concluded that Mitchell's beliefs transcended zeal and was in fact delusional. It was Golding's opinion that Mitchell was not competent to stand trial as a result of his delusions. The court, however, overruled Golding's opinion and found Mitchell to be competent in 2004. It was at this point that plea negotiations subsequently began between the defense and the prosecution. The defense was willing to plead guilty to kidnapping and to burglary for a 10 to 15-year sentence on the condition that Smart should not testify. However, the prosecution was not having this because they refused to drop the sexual assault charges against Mitchell, and no agreement was reached. On October 15th of 2004, plea negotiations had still not come to an agreement. The defence appealed as late as October 21st, asking the prosecution to rethink their position in terms of what they were offering Mitchell. Up until this point, the defence did not highlight breakdown in the competence of a contributing factor to the deterioration of plea negotiations. They cited the lack of coming to an agreement as being the result of sole discretion for their client. The appeal was subsequently rejected. Jennifer Scheme, a psychiatrist who initially stated that Mitchell was competent, interviewed Mitchell again per the defence request in February of 2005. After this interview, Heidi Bucci, who was Mitchell's attorney, filed a brief stating that Mitchell was no longer competent to stand trial. It was after this point that Mitchell subsequently began to act out in court. However, jail staff observed no change in his behaviour and thought process whilst he was incarcerated. Ultimately, Judge Judy Atherton agreed with the defence, asserting that Mitchell's behaviour reflected psychosis. The defendant re-entered the State Utah Hospital on August 11th of 2005 and remained there until 2008. While he was in the hospital, however, no staff members observed Mitchell being paranoid in a pathological sense, further indication that he was in fact making it up or egging it on to prolong this trial, in hopes that it would flip in his favour. In February of 2006, a bill went before the Utah legislature to allow prosecutors to apply for forcible medication on defence to restore their competence to face trial. Permission to forcibly medicate Wanda Barzee was also sought, relying upon the US Supreme Court decision in Sell versus the United States, which permits compulsory medication when the state can demonstrate a compelling interest is served to restore a person's competence and that medication would not harm the person or prevent him or her from defending themselves. In June of 2006, a Utah judge approved this forcible medication of Barzee so that she could stand trial. On December 18th of 2006, Mitchell was again declared unfit to stand trial in the Utah state courts after screaming at a judge during a hearing to forsake those robes and kneel in the dust. Doctors had been trying to treat Mitchell without drugs, but prosecutor Kent Morgan said that after the scene in court that a request was likely to be made for permission to forcibly administer drugs. On December 12th of 2008, it's reported that Mitchell could not legally be forcibly medicated by the state of Utah to attempt to restore his medical competency, also claiming that it is unnecessary and needlessly harsh, and therefore a violation of the Utah state constitution to prolong trial proceedings to this length. The case was eventually transferred to federal court on October 10th of 2008. Issues of competency proved to be a crux in the case, and the court held evidentiary hearings of Mitchell's competency on October 1st of 2009, as well as November 30th through to December 11th of 2009. On one occasion during a hearing in October, it's reported that Mitchell burst out singing hymns in court. During one of these hearings, Smart began to describe Mitchell. She said he was smart, articulate, evil, wicked, compulsory, sneaky, slimy, selfish, greedy, not spiritual, not religious, not close to God. Competency evaluations concluded by Noel Gardner, Michael Wellner and Richard Demir were presented at the hearing. Gardner maintained that he believed Mitchell was fully aware of his actions and was attempting to deceive the court. Wellner, another witness in the case, reviews 2010 sources and 57 separate interviews, including Mitchell, his wife Wanda Barzee, his family, and Elizabeth Smart. The court credited Wellner for presenting a 206-page report. Wellner opted that Mitchell was competent to stand trial and diagnosed him with non-exclusive paedophilia, as well as antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, malingering, and alcohol abuse in a controlled environment. Wellner believed that Mitchell was highly manipulative and used his religious expression as a way to coax people into overlooking his high function and dismissing him as delusional. Experts for the defense, including Dr. Demir, a clinical psychologist, did not dispute these diagnoses. They maintained that he had concurrent fixed delusional disorder, believing that Mitchell was mentally ill at the time of the crime, and this greatly impaired his judgment. Mitchell was deemed competent to stand trial on the 1st of March of 2010. Wanda Barzee eventually pled guilty and was sentenced to concurrent terms of 15 years in the state and federal prison. However, due to the delays and mental evaluations, it took Mitchell's case almost 8 years to come to court. Mitchell's trial began on November 8th of 2010. The defence acknowledged that Mitchell was responsible for the crimes, but contended that he was legally insane at the time of the crime, and should therefore be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The insanity defence for Mitchell was rejected on December 11th of 2010, when the jury found him guilty of kidnapping, transporting a minor across state lines, and with the intent to engage in sexual activity. The US District Judge, Dale A. Kimball, sentenced Mitchell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mitchell is currently serving his sentence in a high-security federal prison in Indiana. In 2016, Barzi's federal imprisonment was terminated, as she was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Castle in Fort Worth, Texas, to the Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah, to begin serving her state prison sentence. She would later go on to be released in September of 2018. Elizabeth Smart would go on to serve as a missionary, and whilst on a Paris mission, Smart met Scottish native Matthew Gilmore. In January of 2012, after a courtship of 1 year, they became engaged. They married on February 18th of 2012 in a private ceremony in the Lei Hawaii Temple. Since then, the couple have had 3 children, born in 2015, 2017 and 2018. Smart has since gone on to work as an activist and an advocate for missing persons. Her life and abduction have been the subject of numerous non-fiction books and films since this occurrence. Elizabeth is now also a journalist, working as a safety activist and commentator for ABC News. This is the story of Elizabeth Smart, a true story of endurance through fear from an incredibly brave girl who has now become a successful woman with a husband and children of her own. Truly remarkable and wonderful to see how she has taken her experiences and made them into something better for herself. So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to comment down below any videos you would like to see next time. Anyway, that is it from me. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye for now.